Welcome to Engaging Cities Fireside Chats. On each episode of the show, I talk to leaders who are paving the way in civic engagement in order to inspire listeners and share strategies that you can implement in your own community. This podcast is proudly supported by our sponsor, Conveo, the engagement platform for plans and policies. Check them out at konveo.com. I'm your host, Kelly Hickler, the community manager with Engaging Cities, as well as the founder of Season1 Studio, which is dedicated to innovative civic education and engagement. So the topic of this week's episode is very timely as we just found out the results of the US presidential election yesterday. I want to point out that we are not promoting one political party or viewpoint over another. In fact, we're not even really discussing national level politics, but we do talk about how what's playing out at the national level affects local communities. This episode is particularly relevant to local government leaders, whether you are a city manager, mayor, city council member, department head, etc. My guest, Nick Vlahos, shares some valuable insights about how you can depolarize and depoliticize the meetings and interactions you're having with your residents. Nick talks about the work he's doing with the Center for Democracy Innovation at the National Civic League, including the Better Public Meetings initiative in Boulder, Colorado, and Mesa, Arizona. This project aims to transform traditional public meeting formats, like the dreaded 3 minutes at the podium, to more inclusive and productive formats that are more like a real conversation. Nick is a self-proclaimed community engagement nerd and has a ton of knowledge and resources to share. In the sake of timeliness, because I wanted to hurry and get this episode out, I didn't have time to include links to everything he mentions in the show notes, but I'll try to add those over the next week or so. Okay, anyway, that's enough of me blabbering. Let's hear from Nick. Well, Nick, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. I'm so glad to have you, especially this week. It's an interesting week. So I'm curious to hear some of the insights that you have for us.
Yeah.
And I know I told you in my email, at least I think I told you in my email, that a previous podcast guest, which is Dr. Martine Carcassonne in Colorado, mentioned you and the work that you're doing in his episode.
Oh, great.
So that's one of the reasons that I reached out to you, and I'm glad to have you join us. So why don't you start out just by telling our listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, how did you get into this line of work?
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me on. I guess I would consider myself a pracademic. So I at least on the academic side, I have a PhD in political science, and so I come at it from a research background that's really interested in sort of how public decision making can address inequality and the different forms of innovations or public deliberative processes and institutional mechanisms that might achieve that in practice. And so that's sort of one angle of it. And then the other angle it is coming at this from actual, a practical standpoint, working in community development, in design thinking engagement for an innovation team out of Bloomberg Center for Public Innovation. And then with elected officials in a few capacities, previously at the Center for Deliberative Democracy and Global Governance at the University of Canberra, and then now at the Center for Democracy Innovation at the National Civic League. And so really it's just a matter of thinking through best practices and how to sort of build into these processes new voices, informed voices, authoritative voices around important issues that might lead to better outcomes and more legitimacy in these processes, and might help people's qualities of life become altered. And so that's sort of how it is. And I'm currently the deputy director of that center. Been here for about now 2 years. So Yeah, we're working really closely with local governments in Colorado and in Arizona and and in other states as well. So yeah, that's just a highlight of me a little bit.
Yeah, thank you. Um, so can you talk a little bit more about what the National Civic League is and what they do?
Yeah, so so I work for the center, which is a 2-year-old institution, part of the Civic League, which is like the oldest, civic good governance organization in the U.S. going back to 1894, 1896. Created by Teddy Roosevelt, Louis Brandeis. And so the Civic League really it's about, in its own form and the original form, about democratic innovation of the time, and creating cities with, a really stable institutional form of democratic governance. They created the Model City Charter. And throughout this phase, been promoting, specific types of governance mechanisms. And we're now at that point where a lot of those mechanisms have been around for a very long time and they haven't really been changed. They're formalized. Some might even say ossified, and the ability to navigate those need to sort of adapt to the current context, the digital era, and everything else that's going on. And so our Center for Democracy Innovation is thinking through the variety of ways to measure engagement, to promote new forms of engagement, learn from other experiences, think about current contexts, and expand it in digital, multi-channel ways and in person. So that's sort of a bit about it. And, the Civic League, we work a lot on the local government level, trying to help with charter revision reforms or working with local governments to implement public deliberation. So yeah, we have a few interesting projects that we're working on. Happy to chat about more about those, but it's really at the cusp of trying to renovate institutions or build new public spaces to help provide the public with some opportunity to inform decisions that impact their lives.
Yeah, that's incredible work that you're doing. And I'm curious, was the center, so it's Center for Democracy Innovation, was that something that was already conceived of or in the works, and then they were looking for a director, or was that something that they already had you in mind? How did you get brought in to?
So first of all, this is really the brainchild of Matt Leinecker, who's the center director of the Center for Democracy Innovation. So, I mean, he's been a leader in the field for over 2 decades, and working in the space in a variety of different organizations, like literally across the democracy landscape, in the U.S. And so he's sort of incubated this idea, and I've known Matt through a few adventures at local government level and in helping out with participatory budgeting in his hometown, where we sort of connected, and so similar interests and me trying to follow in the footsteps of his excellent work is sort of how we sort of connected on that. And so I know that Matt is really trying to situate this work in a really well-established institution that has a long history and line of thinking along this way. So, and just pushing this work forward nationally and also within communities across the country.
Okay, I see. So as I mentioned, I'm really glad to have you on the podcast this week specifically. Today, actually, we just found out the results of the
Yeah,
election.
right.
So, there is a highly polarized, a highly emotionally charged climate right now,
Hmm.
politically.
Hmm.
And, the focus of our podcast is not politics and not certainly not national level politics. So we won't go too much into that. But I think it's important to
Hmm.
mention because I imagine that many city leaders, whether there's the city manager, the mayor, city council, department
Hmm.
heads, etc., maybe facing kind of some of the fallout of this in the next few days, weeks, months, where maybe they're going to be seeing some more political discussions brought in to local decisions where maybe it doesn't belong, or maybe there's
Mhm.
more polarization, people more upset than normal. I mean, I don't know. We'll see what happens.
Mhm.
So I'm curious if you have any thoughts or words of wisdom to share with local government leaders who are in those positions of how might they approach this? How might they handle those types of situations?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to put this in a broader context, a historical context. This isn't what we're experiencing. I mean, it might feel like it's brand new, but it's not. And what I mean by this is the nuances of public participation and how it's inserted into our representative democracy. There's just there is just a lot of evidence from around the world, and the U.S. isn't an outlier in this in terms of the public apathy, towards the democratic deficits that we have of our political institutions, the lack of meaningful opportunities and voice and influence over outcomes is something that, I think that, we're in a vacuum that's being swept up now under a current political rhetoric. But the reality is it's been around for a long time. I mean, they coined the term 30 years ago, right? So it's been around for some time. And now we're at this position where we're trying to understand how to address, the variability of public attitudes and how it's being impacted in the current climate. So, I mean, I think the important thing to think about is that there is a lot of interesting work that's being done to address polarization. And a lot of it really is just well facilitated, well designed public deliberative processes. And by that, I mean, like people coming together in a neutral, equal space to learn about a subject and talk about it and share their thoughts and opinions, make decisions about these things. And those processes, time and time and time again, produce better outcomes, produce actual meaningful opportunities for people to be heard and feel heard, whether or not you agree with each other. And so, for the message really here is to think about how do we implement more of these. And of course, the local level really is the ground floor of democracy. It really is impacting people's lives on the regular with the amount of things that impact people at a city level. So the opportunity to actually take this and, the outcome of the election and innovate the way that processes are happening, make people feel heard, fill the vacuum in rhetoric that of what's happening with more meaningful conversations and build, these spaces, I think is there. And, there's, we do a lot of this work, but there's a lot of organizations that do this type of work, in every state. So I think there really is, if the earnest willingness is there, then it should be built upon and utilize this as an opportune moment to make changes that I think people really are yearning for.
Thank you for that insight. And I'm curious to hear, well, maybe we can share after the show, and I can include it in the show notes, some of these other organizations that are in
Yeah.
different states or maybe more local organizations that people could reach
Mhm.
out to for some assistance or resources
Yeah, absolutely.
we could share. So, all right, we won't go too far off the rails to talking about politics, but I
Yeah,
thought, let's definitely bring that up and touch on that this week. So,
sure.
you mentioned in your intro that you had some specific project examples that you could share with our listeners.
Mhm.
So, if you want to pick one of those, whether it's something you worked on with the Center for Democracy Innovation or something else in your career, some engagement effort that went really well. Tell us about that and why did it go so well?
I mean, I think this slots really nicely into post-election and the conversation you're talking about. Um, Really, it's our Better Public Meetings project, our Democracy Innovations for Better Public Meetings project that was funded by the AAA ICDR Foundation. So we had a grant to work with 3 pilot communities, and I'm thinking specifically of the work in Boulder and Mesa. Um, and really, what it is addressing the challenges of polarized atmospheres in official public meetings. So in Mesa, it's a school board. In Boulder, it's a city council.
Okay. And
And
this is
so what
Boulder, Colorado.
Boulder, Colorado. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And
So
Mesa, is that
Arizona.
Arizona? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah,
Just
yeah.
clarifying.
Yeah, absolutely. So, two different states, two different types of official meeting, but
Mhm.
as we're going to be, as everyone knows, they're really hotly contested, these public meetings, because of the way that they're set up. So in
Mhm.
Mesa, it's a school board. It's a really tense dynamic. They have had to hire security guards, I mean, like, and then in the case of Boulder, um, the types of rhetoric that's being seen, and the criticisms that's being lobbed at city council from the public. I mean, a lot of this comes down to, in one sense, format, institutional design, space design, like the way that these meetings, which go back 75 to 100 years, haven't really been adjusted, right? And so, the rationale behind this is, we need to think about how we renovate our existing institutions, because they are spaces that exist. They are the spaces that make decisions. We might want to think about parallel processes that have this, but on the flip side is that these are where elected officials and our democratic processes feed into. So how do we make them better? And how do we avoid, the sort of polarization that's happening in these spaces? And the real challenge there is that, the form of public participation comes in public comment periods. You go up to a microphone, you get 2 or 3 minutes, speak at a dais, the elected officials don't respond. Everyone leaves dissatisfied because, the public are talking at the officials not responding. There's no feedback loop. And it's usually at the end of a process, right? So, I mean, in thinking about where we're at in the current political climate, there's levels of frustrations are being built up over time, and the attitudes towards these institutions are just compounding over time. How do we make them better? And so that's essentially what this one project is. So we worked really closely with these communities, specifically with internal team members, to design a process that was informed by research, and then involved, stakeholder conversations, and then had community meetings, and then eventually recommendations that are leading to pilots and actual democratic innovation and implementation. So I guess when we want to think about the longevity of this process, it took about a year in the work, in both Boulder and in Mesa, Arizona.
Okay.
And yeah,
Were these happening parallel with each other, or was it
happening parallel.
one? Oh, okay. All right.
I mean, for the most part, they're happening in parallel, with give or take a few months difference, and it's somewhat still ongoing, because, the research portion of this phase is now into the point of implementation. And so, I think the key aspect here is that there is a research portion here. We need to measure civic attitudes, and evaluate public processes, and create some sort of baseline for us to be able to make recommendations and adjustments to civic and public engagement, and how it feeds into these processes. And I'm happy to talk a little bit more about the two research portions, which is we have a civic engagement scorecard, and we have a civic infrastructure scan. And so those are the two things that sort of informed how we promote ideas for the local governments or official bodies to implement. And then we work really closely to sort of craft these ideas into something that a community can actually implement, and working with their local teams to do it.
Okay. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that, because the civic infrastructure scans and the engagement scorecards is
Yeah.
something that you offer, that's available
Yeah.
to any jurisdiction, right, who
Yeah.
wanted to use that service. So
Absolutely.
these are two cities that you've actually implemented these in. So
Yeah.
yeah, that would be great to hear a little bit more about what each of those
Yeah.
is.
Yeah. So, I mean, if we want to think about understanding civic infrastructure, we need to know what our local context is. So when we think about this, what are the various networks and streams of participation that exist in civil society and within governments? Within the government, what are the departments doing? What are the city council meetings doing? What are the various different staff and elected officials doing to engage the public? And then at a community level, what are the neighborhood associations, nonprofit groups, and the like that are engaging the public? And so can we learn from and can we share what they each have a perspective on to provide a comprehensive and nuanced understanding of the way civic infrastructure is in the community? Because people from within government or people from within civil society might have their own thoughts and opinions on things, but it's rarely put together in one package to say, hey, this is what each of different people are thinking. Here are the interesting things that are being done. How do we connect these? But also, how do we expand them and draw upon these various resources that exist? So that's one angle. The other angle really is measuring. It's measuring what the public think about public meetings. And so I think it's an interesting thing, because rarely do you have an opportunity, if you show up to a public consultation or a public hearing or a board meeting, an opportunity to provide any sort of input that might help create a better process or provide an initial feedback of that process. You can go to a restaurant and you get a Google review. You can't do that in a public meeting. So the civic engagement scorecard really is modeled around Yelp. It's a quick tool for people that attend meetings to provide some baseline data. For example, like, what did they think about the overall experience? How did they participate? Was it virtual or in person? Is this their first time? Do they think that this process has good things that's going for it? What are the things that could be changed? And what we're finding from these is that, there is an appetite for civil dialogue and an opportunity for their decisions to inform, or their input to inform decisions. And so in thinking about just these two things, it allows us to now promote, okay, how do we create spaces of civil dialogue? How do we create a through line from input into decisions? And how do we leverage that with all the various different forms of community infrastructure? And this is how we come together with sort of a set of recommendations that work. And then, one or two of these are picked as a pilot to implement, given the context of that community.
Okay, see. So both Boulder and Mesa have already gone through the infrastructure scan, or the civic infrastructure scan, their
Yep.
engagement scorecard,
Yes, they have.
and now they're both in the implementation phase, where they've picked a few things that were identified to implement. Okay.
And those reports are public. So they're presented to the community. They're on our website. In the case of Boulder, it's actually on their government website. So it's something that it's a public process that goes through official channels. And then at some point, you really think about, okay, now how do we involve the community even more than just the initial interviews and conversations that are happening, and have some form of public forum to talk about what these thoughts are before implementation happens. And so that creates sort of another level of involving of the community in this process.
I'm so curious what were identified as what came out of these scans and scorecards in both, and were they kind of similar findings or completely different?
I mean, so they're different. Number one, they're different places, and they're different types of meetings. But across the board, there really is. I mean, there are challenges that need to be addressed, and the real basic ones really are around the need to be heard and the want and the feeling of being heard, and how do we sort of craft a process around that. And that really is about effective forms of communication that are implemented between elected officials and residents. So that's common across the board. You start to hear other nuances because the issues are different. It's school boards, they're really focused on culture, what they would call culture wars and a lot of things. that aren't necessarily, the most important to the community, but those are the focal point. Whereas in city council meetings, it's really about, the stage of the policy process, and how to create through lines and, earlier on in a policy process rather than at the very end.
Mm-hmm.
I will say, I mean, the scorecard provides a nuanced set of information, whereas the initial thoughts are that when you implement this, it's just going to be the public trashing the entire process. And what you actually find is there's variation in what people think about the values of these processes, but that they can be made better. So I think it's a strong case for a community to actually implement these. I think they should be done across, like, why wouldn't we want to know how to better create a process and use that to inform, our meeting structure and efficiency and inclusivity.
Yeah, I'm curious the answer to that. Why don't more cities take this approach and ask their constituents or residents about this? I like how you compared it to Yelp. Why don't they kind of ask for this feedback and try to improve? And I mean, I have some guesses on answers, but maybe I'll throw it out to our
Yeah,
listeners. What is holding everyone back from even just collecting feedback about the
yeah,
process? And I understand maybe can't always implement the things that residents suggest what their wish list is, but well, we should at least be
yeah,
asking the
yeah.
questions.
I
So,
mean,
oh, go ahead.
I can point you to a couple answers to that. I mean, one of them is that they might think that it's an arduous process that needs to be created. And I think what we've shown is that it really is, it's a very basic survey template in Alchemy or SurveyMonkey with a QR code. And so it's not overly complicated. The second is that the fear behind public attitudes and whether or not this is going to just be the public lambasting the process. But I mean, it's it's you give an opportunity to provide basic information, but then also nuanced information. And so it's not open-ended, but it provides an opportunity to provide critical, but also structured, input into the process. So I think what the officials have come out with this is that it's not nearly as bad as they thought it was going to be, because, there are things that provide constructive thoughts and inputs on the processes. So those are at least two things, that we might do to overcome. Is
Mm-hmm.
it's not that hard to implement, and it's going to provide you with valuable information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Nick, I'm curious if there's any challenges that you faced during this process, anything that didn't go as planned, unexpected hiccups, and what were those and how did you deal with those?
I mean, any sort of process that involves, public engagement faces its own challenges. I think one that we faced is, making sure that we have a strong sense of political will and willingness from a variety of different stakeholders to be able to actually do this work. And you do need a commitment from not just, public engagement professionals that are really savvy around this process, but the actual decision makers like a city council or a board. And are they behind this idea and wanting to make this change? And so that's a challenge is the ability to sort of have these conversations and needing a proof of concept to sort of address the fears and concerns of what it might look like to make, to commit to a process. So that's one thing. The other thing is messaging. How do you craft the appropriate messaging where it looks like what you're doing is actually trying to build upon and strengthen what exists in better ways? And so, some of our messaging might have been misinterpreted a few times around us wanting to replace public comment with deliberative public comment. We want to take the mic away, but gives you voice and more time to actually have conversations directly with your elected officials. But I think the loss of translation there is we're taking away your voice, which
Mm,
really is a performative voice. It's not a
mhm.
nuanced conversational voice. And so why is that better? It's not necessarily something that people think is better, or they haven't thought about it,
Mhm.
so making sure that the messaging is not trying to silence people, but actually
Right.
with coming from the position that you're trying to enhance their opportunities to inform a process. And so I would think that, and then of course, community buy-in is also important. So that's part of that messaging process. So making sure that you're not just, it's important, it's good that we can come in as a third party because sometimes that's useful, but also, recognizing that, there are community stakeholders, community groups, and the public that you need to sort of have conversations and build that sort of goodwill with them and ensure that, they're part of that process. So those sort of three things I think are really key, to dealing with the sort of challenges that you come across.
Okay. Did you come up with some alternative ways to deliver the message? Did you figure out a different wording or something? Or
Um, I think it's just working really, I guess this is one of those challenges that when you come from an academic background, you have just really a dense lexicon. And that's just probably my problem, that I have to work as a professional to learn how to message better. And that's why we have a comms director and I'm not in comms. But I mean, I think it's, this is where your partnerships with the internal team and staff of your partner is where that, they can help with messaging. They know better what's going to actually fly and pass council. I know different types of things that you say, like, um, are useful in this context. And so, just being able to iterate and pass that through multiple channels so that you have that, language that meets, the sort of needs of people.
okay, so there's not some one magical phrase that's going to work for everyone. It really
No.
depends on the jurisdiction and the people
Yep.
who know it the best, know, okay, do not say this and you should say this, and
Yeah.
that's the magic. That's where the magic happens.
It really is. I mean, they're the ones that are living the contentious scenarios that they're in, like in Mesa, Arizona. There are just some things that, especially in framing our scorecard language and the things that just might, create problems for them. We're not trying to, we're trying to get information, but we're trying to avoid this process being viewed as just simply a political tool by the people in power. We want, it to be cross partisan and people from all stripes and backgrounds to utilize this. And so it does require carefully thinking about the language that you use, on your, on whatever tools you're implementing.
Yeah, I'm curious if through this process in either city were there some residents who initially were very skeptical, mistrusting of this, like, hey, what are you trying to do here?
Yeah.
That going through the process kind of came around to seeing, oh, no, this is actually good, and thank you for doing this. Or, was there anyone who kind of changed their tune after going through this?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when we initially proposed this idea in Mesa, there are, a regular set of people that show up time and time and again, and they're very critical of the process. Um, and they had a problem with, so-called external people coming into their community to do this work.
Mm.
But I reached out to them and interviewed them and included their voice into the project. And then over time, they started to reach out to us to talk about more thoughts about that process. In this and in the same, similar but different in Boulder. they've actually taken this into the public realm, and they have their own conversations and debates about our project, which is fascinating to see the sort of back and forths in their little community newspapers, community bulletins, about whether or not they think this may or may not work. What are the problems with it? What are they trying to do? But then, post implementation, which I'll talk later about, or at some point, then coming around to the idea that there is an interesting possibility with what this can bring. And I think they're grateful overall with the willingness of the officials to actually make a concerted effort to try something different and pilot something new.
Yeah, I love that in Boulder they took ownership of it and had their own side discussion. That's so Boulder.
Yeah,
And
it really is. It really
yeah,
is.
I used to live in Colorado. I lived in different parts of Colorado. I lived in Longmont for a while. That's near Boulder. See, I wore my best Colorado outfit
Oh,
today.
great.
Um, all right, Nick. Then let's talk about how you measure success of this process. And do you have
Yeah.
specific metrics that you use to measure that success?
Yeah. So, I mean, just sort of going back to, really, really quickly, we want to understand the context through research and conversations, build up data to inform the process. We want to be iterative and adaptable in molding our process to local circumstances. And then we sort of want to understand the landscape of democratic innovations, how to leverage these. So then when we think about measuring this thing, for example, are public attitudes toward the process increasingly good? Our political attitudes towards this process increasingly good? Our staff attitudes towards this process increasingly good? Did new people show up? Was there meaningful opportunities to discuss? Is there a good follow up? And ultimately, is that process transparent and authentic in its willingness and wanting to innovate this process? So again, this is where the sort of the valuations can come in. So if we continue with the through line of the scorecard, some people might want to just do pre and post surveys. We
Mhm.
just implement the scorecard consistently. And then over time, you start to see a change over time. What happened, from the first time you implemented it versus when you actually implemented an innovation. And so at some point we should talk about that innovation. We can do that after this, but um, the in our evaluation, at least in Boulder, public, political, and staff attitudes have
Mhm.
become really favorable towards the innovation and the pilot that they innovated, and so that's a measure of success.
So then, do you have any key takeaways that you can share with the listeners about this?
Yeah, so I mean, the takeaways really are, just having that willingness, um, just having the team willingness in the face of uncertainty to do something interesting and different, um, but also that this isn't, I think one of the main lessons is that this is a tried and tested field of work that has decades of successful experience. You talked about Martine and earlier on, like working in this space. There is a lot of work on public deliberation and the positive potential that it does to bring people together, to make more informed discussions, to have mutual respect, and so the willingness to do it, but building upon stuff that showcases, a longevity over time. Um, I think the other, sort of, I guess, takeaway is that, that institutions, they do need to be renovated. They do, and the relationships with them and within them need to be rebuilt. And this can happen in places that might be considered unmovable. Like, we worked within a city council and they innovated a city council meeting. Like it might be the first, of its kind and pave the way for this type of reform. Like the fact that a city council chose to innovate its meeting, I think really showcases that there is a positive potential of doing this work, and I think I probably should talk a little bit about, the pilot and, talk a little bit about that. We did this research, we provided a bunch of recommendations. The recommendations were broad in terms of, how do we implement digital input into the process? How do we promote community engagement in the broader community? Maybe we want to implement things like citizens assemblies and whatnot. But what we ended up with was a pilot around a study session. So a study session is where elected officials, it's an official body, they all come together, it's an official meeting to learn about a specific subject. And this is earlier on in the policy process. It's a fishbowl. The public can view but they're not allowed to participate. So what we created was a community and council forum on September 26th this year. And essentially what it is, take away the dais, take away a microphone, create a round table. So now you have a level playing field where the public are going to be able to sit at a round table amongst elected officials, different sort of space scenario. From there, we thought about 20 residents that would participate. And it was, 10 of them were invited from underheard communities. And the other 10 were selected by civic lottery sortition that were at the meetings that wanted to participate. So we had a mixture of people from community and that showed up to the meeting. And then the process design really is presentation, breakout group discussion with 2 elected officials and 5 community members per table, Q&A, and then closing. And so we really implemented this sort of small group deliberative dialogues, facilitated conversations, note takers, generating themes from that and presenting that back to the plenary. And the post evaluations of this show that at least 7 of the elected officials are in favor of continuing forward with this, and the public are favorable toward this process. And they should be, because they've never been able to participate in a study session ever, so,
Right.
and in this way, not just going up to a microphone, actually conversing with your elected official face to face, so it's a really interesting thing that they did there. And I think, I really hope that it just, all these city managers and folks that you were talking about that might be looking for inspiration. Boulder is a really interesting place for that. And Mesa is now in the process of doing their own variation of this as well, where they're going to involve the local student council, parent advisory council, and think about a very similar study session as well. And so this might be, the first wave of these processes. And we might start to think about how to collaborate in other ways to strengthen these digitally as well.
Yeah, I think once you have a few cities who are bigger cities like Boulder who
Yeah.
are actually implementing this and people see, oh, hey, that worked out well for them, that kind of dispels some of the fear about trying it. Like, well, hey, they did it. Maybe we can do it too.
Yeah.
And I like that in Boulder, it wasn't, we are now doing it this way. It was, hey, let's try
Right.
this. Let's try this and
Yeah.
see how it goes. And if it's terrible, then we can get rid of it or make adjustments. Doesn't have to
And it turned
be
out that
all or none.
they like it.
Yeah.
That, first time they got it right, but they put a lot of effort into it, into really, I mean, what made that so successful is the internal team. You have, the Department of Civic Engagement, you have a council subcommittee on civic engagement, and crafting and working together with us to come with an agenda and an input that has the spirit of the recommendations, and then doing a first pass with all of city council. Council provided thoughts and inputs and concerns around, inclusivity, went back to the drawing board, iterated that process, brought it back to a full council meeting. That passed, they implemented. There's a lot of buy-in and initial community conversation so that it created, that sort of, I think, that legitimacy to try something different and new. And because a lot of thought and input went into it, translation services, well-facilitated conversations, note takers, the design of the presentation, I think it all made for, a really excellent pilot and a first time.
Yeah, and you said on Boulder's website there's some information about all of this. Okay, so I'll
You could watch the
definitely.
plenary. It was
Oh
the
yeah.
actual
Oh,
yeah,
okay.
the plenary. I mean, the breakouts weren't recorded, but the plenary, it's all there, live stream on their, and it was recorded on their YouTube channel. So you can watch to see for the first time what it looks like to see a city council sitting at a round table with 20 residents. It's a really fascinating thing to see for sure.
Cool. I'll definitely link that in the show notes. So, Nick, I'm curious, in your opinion, what is
Yeah.
one small change that either local governments or consultants or both
Yeah.
could adopt to improve community engagement?
I'll stick to the one small change. I mean, I could probably give you a list of them, but I mean, I think the one small change that's a very small lift that might lead to the the ability to more change is to create a baseline of data about these processes. And so when I say like evaluate and measure your existing civic processes so that you can leverage actual information, it can help you use data to 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 sort of promote that sort of change and convince people of a need and a willingness to do it. And so, this can range obviously. I mean, you're saying it as a small change, but I mean, you can do full scale, civic evaluations of your infrastructure, or you can just literally implement something like a scorecard, which doesn't take long to create. I can even provide you with a sample of that template, and you just create a QR code and introduce that at your public meeting. It's really the smallest thing that you can do and get immediate feedback and collate that over time. And it's a very small thing to start with. But if you do that over the course of, 6 months, you're going to have 50 to 100 to 150 responses. And then you get to, start to think about, well, the same sort of patterns and results are coming from this thing. Maybe the changes is go in one direction. Maybe we need to adjust this or we need to adjust that. But something as small as that scorecard, I think, can lead to meaningful change because you have information to work with.
Absolutely. And also, I'm curious how you think that technology will
Mhm.
continue to play a role and shape in how we engage with the community.
I mean, obviously AI is all the rage. It's a massive part of our lives. There's a concern how we leverage it in ethical ways, it to support, the field and democracy. I think that there really is fascinating organizations out there that, we're trying to partner and work with that I think need to be, elevated. Cortico, Whole IS, Decidem, Lakewood Speaks. These are really interesting processes that try to give online voice to the public, to create nuanced conversations, to create data out of these conversations, to help support, a broader public participation rather than just those who show up. So expanding it into the digital realm. And I think, you know, we're just starting to see, how we might leverage open source technology and then how we might leverage these sort of conversations into into in-person deliberations. And they're all doing these Lakewood Speaks is interesting in Colorado, where they provide an opportunity for the public to provide input on agendas for city council meetings. Decidem is a crowdsourcing tool that then allows you to sort of implement public in-person meetings. Whole IS is an online digital space for nuanced conversations of aggregating data. And then Cortico is recording conversations in actual voices and providing um, you know, research as a result of what the public are saying. And so the positive potential of recording conversations in breakout groups and creating and generating themes is to create transparency and a feedback loop of what these people are saying over time. And AI is a part of that, and it's a force for good. So, there's nuances to this field, but I see positive potential in it with these groups that, are there to enhance democracy.
Yeah, I think what AI is really good at is synthesizing information way better than a human can. Like, if I try to
Right.
make sense of a wall of post-it notes,
Yeah.
I can try to group them into themes as best as possible. But if you feed that into AI, and there's AI technology that can, you don't even have to type it. You could just take a picture of the
Yeah.
handwritten notes, and AI will, within seconds,
You're right.
group everything
Right.
into themes and do a way better job than I could ever do. So,
And, why not think about these different ways that we might actually, you know, promote it, and leverage it, that might be beneficial. There's obviously a lot of work that needs to be done, but really interesting groups that are becoming the go-to experts in this space and are willing to work with people.
yeah, absolutely. So are there any other emerging trends? I mean, you're the Center for Democracy Innovation, so you should be at the forefront of trends here. Are
Yeah.
there other emerging
Yeah.
trends that you are excited about?
Oh yeah. I mean, I'm a super democracy nerd, so I'm really interested in a lot of these trends. One of them is charter revision, and I think this is going to be something that we're going to start to talk a lot more about, because essentially it's a mini constitution for your local city. The ability to sort of um, inform a mini, constitution, and how do we get, usually the charter commissions are residents and they don't know necessarily how to engage the public. How can we help that process, you know, become inclusive and be broadly encompassing of a community to inform this, so it's a real, unique thing that's happening all the time. Some cities actually have to review their charters. 10 or 15 or so might be happening in the next 5 to 10 years. How about we create better ways to innovate? I know this sort of ties into thoughts around citizens assemblies. You're going to hear a lot about this. I don't know if I really want to touch too much on it, because I know that so many people that you have in this space are going to talk about that, but we might want to think about representative deliberative processes that use sortition on things like charter commissions or on boards and commissions, and different ways to sort of institutionalize these processes to become parallel bodies, like Paris has really interesting example, or a deliberative committee in Belgium, which has elected officials and the public, work together on, citizen assembly format to come up with policy ideas. And then, of course, I think expanding the base of participatory budgeting is a really necessary thing, and opening up the budgets. New York is doing some really fascinating things with what is having their participatory budget and citizen assemblies merged in their process. So
Hmm.
thinking about, how a public can, come to a community forum, pitch ideas. A citizen assembly later takes all of these ideas, refines them, and it goes back to a community vote. And then probably lastly, I think I'm probably the most excited about this because I've been writing a lot about it, is community land trust. So
Okay.
I find a community land trust really fascinating, because this is a community coming together with the ambition of buying up land and property and holding it in perpetuity, providing affordable housing to the public. And the community is the governing body. The community decides how to govern this property and the adjacent areas, how businesses are going to function in the neighborhood, the public space, and the potential of this, really is, somewhat, it's different in the sense that we really think about these civic engagement processes as almost civic divested from the economic space. They're really trying to decommodify housing, taking it out of a private market, making it public and controlling that. And I think this serves as, creating a common pool of resource that you can govern in your community. And if we can expand those, I think you're going to see a lot of differences in quality of life start to, change. And I think that's the other angle that, we sort of started with the election. We close off with this idea of how do we deal with sort of this sort of disenfranchisement, demobilization. And one way to think about it is, what are the democratic innovations that are related to the economy that might sort of raise quality of life? and give people a voice to influence those things. And community land trust really sits at the sort of interesting center of that, even though it's pretty hyper local. But things that, might arise from that, are a lot more macro.
Do you have an example offhand where that's worked really well? If not, you
I
can
mean,
think of it later.
no, I mean, there are community land trusts all across the United States. They're all over the place, and that's the interesting thing, is that you just don't hear about this as much because we're so focused on politics and the political and the civic and institutions. We're not really thinking about how we create, spaces of governance where the public actually do the control. It's all these. How do we insert them into to representative democratic processes where there's elected officials, but these land trusts, they govern themselves, and it's really interesting. So, I mean, and an example would be like, the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust. You know, they have 200 some odd buildings, or two, and and then, dozens and dozens upon units. And they have thematic areas and subgroups and working committees where the public get to become part of. So it's an opportunity for the public to actually have real impact and real change and actually govern something, not rely on other people, and not go through the filtering of other governance mechanisms, but them do it
Mhm.
themselves.
Mhm.
Really interesting stuff. And it's starting to pick up steam. You're going to start to see a lot more of these community land trusts spring up because the housing affordability crisis is really something that people are starting to rethink in new and
Mhm.
unique and innovative ways. We just need to make sure that they're democratic and they maintain their democratic edge.
Mhm. Yeah, I have to admit, I don't know that much. I mean, I'm familiar with the general idea of community land trust. I've never
Yeah.
worked on one. I'm not super familiar with that process. So that might be an interesting follow-up episode
Yeah.
just to delve into that. And what I like about
Mhm.
that is it sounds very empowering for
It is.
people, where
Mhm.
I think people feel disempowered with national level politics, especially the presidential election, because
Yep.
what you cast your vote and then you sit back and hope that your candidate won, but you feel maybe powerless. Whether your candidate won or not, you
Mm.
just don't feel like you have that much say or that much power to
Mhm.
actually do anything. And this community land trust uh, process is a very empowering tool for people
Mm.
to not just have input, but to make decisions, to
Mhm.
implement things. So, yeah, that'd
It
be
really is
great.
a tangible space. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And the people that get included are also, you start to think about spaces where you're dealing with situations of poverty. So the people that are included are underrepresented groups. It's not always the case, but, in many cases it is. So now we're starting to think about, really inclusive spaces that of governance, so I would be happy to chat more about that.
Cool. Let's
Yeah.
schedule it. Um, all right. Nick, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me and our listeners today. Where can people follow you and or reach out to you if they have follow-up questions, just
Yeah.
want to follow along?
I mean, you can definitely just email me, nickv@ncl.org, visit our website, visit the center's website. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm always willing to chat and have a conversation about this work. And, so happy to carry that conversation forward.
Cool. Well, thanks again, and I will see you in the future.
Really. Thanks so much. Really appreciated you having me on. Take care.
All right, as always, thank you, listeners, for tuning in, and thanks again to our generous sponsor, Conveo. head on over to engagingcities.org, where you can find additional episodes and other helpful resources related to community engagement. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.